If you thought the Sentabali scandal was bad, Prince Harry's African Park scandal, confirmed by reports and withheld, is even worse. It's inhumane, it's urgent. An independent probe into African parks, a conservation charity closely linked to Prince Harry, has confirmed multiple human rights abuses by its park rangers. The abuses in Congo's Odzala-Kokua National Park are shocking. Beatings, torture, rape, and forced displacement of indigenous Baka people. These are not isolated incidents. Allegations of brutality have circulated for years, but only now have investigators validated the violence Baka communities have long reported. One man described being handcuffed, his head forced underwater, whipped with a belt, calling the rangers' actions cruel and barbaric. This must stop. Another Baka woman was raped at gunpoint while clinging to her newborn baby. And a teenage boy was groomed for paid sex by a park guard. Some of the gruesome examples of the alleged atrocities that Harry is linked to and is refusing to step down as a board member. African parks are killing us slowly. We're suffering so much that we might as well be dead, one Baka tribesman told the Mail on Sunday. These disturbing revelations paint a starkly different picture of African parks from its public image as a wildlife protector. Harry's role is a long-standing involvement with African parks. He began working with the charity in 2016 and served as its president for several years. In 2023, he was elevated to the African Parks Board of Directors, putting his name and reputation squarely behind the organization. Harry often speaks of Africa as his second home and has been lauded for championing conservation and community causes there. In fact, around the same time these abuse allegations were coming to light, Harry was feted at a Los Angeles gala as a humanitarian environmentalist dedicated to causes like African parks, but with rangers under African Parks purview accused of heinous acts, Harry's association with the charity has come under intense scrutiny. The painful irony is that while the prince portrays himself as a global advocate, the disturbing revelations at African parks are ongoing as he continues to promote his mission as a social justice campaigner and fighter for equality, raising questions about whether his humanitarian brand is like everything else surrounding him, a fraud following global media reports, and a formal complaint from the human rights group Survival International. African Parks hired an external law firm, Omnia Strategy, headed by Cherie Blair, to investigate the abuse allegations. That investigation confirmed that multiple abuses took place, corroborating the Baka people's accounts. In a public statement on May 8, 2025, African Parks acknowledged that in some incidents, human rights abuses have occurred and said, "We deeply regret the pain and suffering that these have caused to the victims." The charity admitted that the probe highlighted several failures in its systems during the early years managing Odzala-Kokua Park and promised to implement reforms. But the full Omnia investigation report was not released to the public, and African Parks has refused to publish the detailed findings or allow Omnia to do so. Instead, the organization issued only a short summary response, leaving many specifics shrouded in secrecy. We still don't know the details of what they found because African Parks has refused to allow the findings to be made public, lamented Caroline Pierce, Survival International's director. This lack of transparency has fueled criticism that African Parks might be shielding itself and its high-profile patrons from accountability. Survival International, which had spent over a decade warning African Parks about abuses, blasted the charity's opaque handling of the probe. Pierce noted that African Parks' pledges of more reports, more staff, and more guidelines ring hollow, given that similar promises over the past 10 years did nothing to prevent horrific abuses and violations of international human rights law in parks under its control. But African Parks had been alerted as far back as 2013 that rangers in Congo were terrorizing locals, but the problems persisted. Even during the Omnia investigation itself, new allegations surfaced. Park guards allegedly beat a group of Baka women and children so severely that one pregnant woman lost her unborn baby, an attack that occurred while investigators were nearby. Such incidents strongly suggest that some rangers still felt they could act with impunity. And this is who Harry still chose to attach his name and reputation to. So what does that say about him? Critics worry that African Park's internal inquiry could end up a whitewash, especially since investigators arrived in Baka villages, escorted by park officials and government agents, intimidating victims, chilling truthful testimony. In short, while the probe has confirmed the abuse, the decision to withhold the full report has raised fears of a cover-up and calls for greater accountability. As the public face and a board member of African Parks, Prince Harry now finds himself in an uncomfortable spotlight. So far, he has not personally commented on the investigation's findings. A spokesperson for his foundation indicated that Harry, upon learning of the allegations last year, immediately escalated them to the CEO and chairman of African Parks. There is growing pressure on Harry to take a clear stand publicly or even to cut ties with the charity altogether, given the gravity of the confirmed abuses. He needs to distance himself from an organization that is complicit in evictions and the heinous abuse of Indigenous people, said Fiore Longo, Survival International's campaigns director, calling on Harry to step down from African Parks Board. Longo and others argue that as long as Harry remains in a leadership role, he is effectively endorsing or excusing the park's oppressive tactics. A true humanitarian cannot stay silent in the face of such suffering. The scandal is prompting a deeper reflection on the conservation model that African Parks and, by extension, Harry have championed. The charity manages 22 parks across 12 African countries, often in partnership with governments, and has been heralded for protecting wildlife. Yet, critics say African Parks practices a heavy-handed fortress conservation approach reminiscent of old colonial era preservation, evicting or marginalizing the very indigenous communities who have stewarded those lands for generations. Survival International's Caroline Pierce did not mince words. The root of the problem is that African Parks continues to cling to a racist and colonial model of conservation, which kicks out the indigenous people whose land it is, while outsiders take control. Under this model, armed guards patrol the forests like an occupying force, and local people are treated as intruders on their own ancestral home. For Harry, who has spoken passionately about fighting racism and championing social justice, being associated with what some label a colonial conservation project is highly damaging. But he still has yet to resign. If Harry and other celebrities really want to save the planet, combat racism, fight for social justice, and support human diversity, they should be supporting Indigenous people. And as the Baka people put it, this is not conservation, it's destruction. Celebrity supporters like Harry should pull the plug on African Parks now and stop their complicity in this crime. What does this mean for Harry's role? So far, African Parks has not indicated any leadership changes. And Harry has appeared at events promoting the charity, even as the investigation was underway. He notably hosted a high-profile African Parks event in New York in late 2024, drawing criticism for ignoring the abuse allegations during his speech. He can use his influence to demand real reforms and transparency from African Parks, essentially leveraging his royal clout to protect the Baka people and others, or resign to distance himself from the scandal. Staying on board without vocal condemnation is seen as tacit approval of the status quo, undermining Harry's credibility as a human rights advocate. The palace intrigue aside, many campaigners simply want Harry to speak up. As one Baka elder pleaded in an interview, he wishes Harry would use his power to intervene to stop the pain and suffering caused to our community. In the end, the prince's actions or inaction will speak louder than his past words about humanitarianism. The world is watching to see whether Prince Harry will remain a patron of African Parks or heed the calls to cut ties in light of these confirmed abuses. Optics of the white savior complex, Harry has fallen into a classic white savior role, a wealthy Western do-gooder basking in praise for helping Africans, while the actual African people in those parks suffer or are voiceless. The notion of Harry as a savior is painfully undercut by the investigation's findings. As one outlet dryly noted, Harry's charity proudly boasts that it saves wildlife by working with local communities. Yet, investigators discovered a very different reality. Atrocities inflicted on the Baka to stop them entering their own forests. In other words, the people at the heart of the solution, Harry once spoke of, ended up with boots on their necks, a dark twist of the conservation narrative. Satirists have seized on this disconnect. After all, here is a prince who frequently highlights his love of Africa and even handpicked the Odzala rainforest for a private getaway with Meghan early in their courtship, as he recounted in his memoir, now confronted with the fact that his beloved wilderness parks were being guarded like war zones. Harry went to save the elephants, but who will save the people from Prince Harry's saviors? In a brief but pointed aside, the scandal has also brought Meghan into the critical crosshairs. Meghan, who rarely spoke about her biracial identity, but lied about the racism she was facing as a royal, is accused of wielding her race when advantageous, while otherwise presenting herself as and socializing in a predominantly white world is no better than Harry. On their 2019 Africa tour, for instance, Meghan was photographed hugging and smiling with Black African children, images that boosted her humanitarian image. But it was seen as using local kids as a photogenic backdrop for a PR campaign, a familiar trope of royal visits. Nearly all of Meghan's close friends and allies are white celebrities, not members of the Black community. On social media, the hashtag Meghan is racist even trended at one point, with users arguing that none of her friends are Black except those she trots out that suit her latest agenda. And she only dates and marries white men. They suggest Meghan has been cosplaying as a racial justice champion, while in reality, she spent her whole life trying to erase her Blackness. But in the context of African parks, the jabs take on a satirical bite. Both Harry and Meghan are being lampooned as would-be saviors who love to lecture about racism and equality, yet seemingly ended up reinforcing old patterns of white privilege. Meghan herself once acknowledged that in Hollywood she could pass as what casting directors called an exotic Caucasian, benefiting from her light-skinned appearance. That comment has not aged well. Rachel Meghan plays the race card only when it suits her narrative. Both Harry and Meghan appear to see Africa as a convenient backdrop for virtue signaling, whether it's Meghan posing as a conservation hero or Harry cradling an African child for the cameras. The optics are tiring and offensive. In summing up this saga, we find a potent mix of genuine human rights concerns and bruising public relations for the Sussexes. The African Park scandal has serious implications. Real people, the Baka and other indigenous groups, have endured beatings, rapes, and trauma in the name of conservation. That alone warrants global attention and outrage. It raises urgent questions about how conservation programs are run and whether a militarized colonial approach can ever be ethical or effective. The answer is hell no, but the scandal's resonance is amplified because of Harry's involvement. It challenges his carefully crafted image as a different kind of royal, one who champions the downtrodden and fights for what's right. The confirmed abuses have made Harry's patronage of African parks look outrageously hypocritical and problematic. Is Harry willing to re-examine his own role and privilege in this context? Will he demand change or quietly hope the issue blows over? The coming weeks and months will be telling. Harry once said of African parks, "What I see in the African parks model is exactly what conservation should be about, putting people at the heart of the solution. Now that this model has been exposed for putting these people in danger, the world is waiting to see if Harry will live up to his own words. Will he put the Baka people's rights at the heart of the solution, or will this so-called prince, hailed as a hero, quietly step back and fade from the frame when the narrative is no longer convenient?" The ball, much like an endangered elephant in one of his parks, is in Harry's court. His handling of this scandal may determine if he is remembered as a true champion of humanitarian conservation or merely a white savior figurehead lost in the jungle of pretend good intentions gone very wrong. Subscribe for updates and continue to follow my investigative reporting on this story and more. Like, share, or stay Delulu. Bye.